So I was reading the paper the other day and I read an article and with my usual reading the news with my usual naive guy act, or is it an act? I saw this article that said that President Biden is imposing 100% tax on electric vehicles from China. Now, you and I have talked before about electric vehicles from China, how incredibly cheaply they can make these functioning vehicles. I think 12, $13,000 or something they retail for in some parts of the world. And I was kind of thinking about that in terms of if I didn't follow all this and analyze this kind of thing, what would I think as a working person about the fact that uh, I might have been able to get a really cheap car, and cars are really expensive, the most expensive household item next to a house, I think, typically. So a cheap car would be great. Um, Doubling it is supposed to help my fellow workers in the auto industry, with this tariff that's on it. But, a lot of that money goes to the executives at the car companies who give themselves big stock buybacks. So I kind of think if I think about this for a second as a working person, I'm getting screwed by this deal. But I wanted to know what your thoughts were on it.
Well, my first thought is you're right. You are getting screwed, and so is the American working class. Now, on the one hand, that's not exactly a new item. We see that all the time. We talk about it, and most Americans half expect it anyway. But what's interesting about this is that it has so many other dimensions that are equally, well, not to put too fine a point on it, horrendous. Let me give you just a few. We're supposed to be facing a climate crisis. We're supposed to be interested in preventing rising temperatures. We're supposed to be interested in the whole environmental question. And one of the so-called virtues of the electric automobile is that it pollutes less, significantly less, than a gas-guzzling car or truck. By jacking up the price of what is now the best quality and lowest priced electric vehicle, we know you will reduce the number of people who make the conversion. You will slow the process of going to electric. In other words, what this shows is the contempt of the Biden administration to take the whole climate issue seriously, because this is a direct contradiction to doing that. Number two, there have been a dozen studies of the impact of tariffs in the past, of the tariffs hitting China under the Trump administration, and so on. And guess what those papers show? The impact on employment, trivial, negligible, not significant, one way or the other. So to claim, as Biden does, that he is protecting jobs is basically nonsense, and it can be easily explained. If you double the price, let's assume that the Chinese can bring to the United States for $20,000 a functioning, comfortable electric vehicle. Okay? The reason you haven't seen them already, by the way, they're all over the world. They're already in Europe and so forth. You haven't seen them here because there's already a 27.5% tariff on them. All that Mr. Biden did is raise it from 27.5 to 100%. In other words, that car, if you're an American and you buy it, you will have to pay $20,000 to the Chinese who made it and $20,000 to the United States government who taxed it with a tariff of 100%, which means the car will be $40,000 and therefore many fewer people will afford it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if that were the end of the story, you could say, well, at least No American worker working in a gas producing car factory will lose the job because those cars will be sold since we've tariffed the other ones out of the market. But that's not correct. And here's a simple explanation. Anybody in this country who wants to now buy an electric vehicle, a car or a truck, will not buy the Chinese. He'll buy the American one. Why? Because the American one, let's say it costs $30,000, because the Chinese have outcompeted the American producers. That's why we're doing this. If people had their druthers, they'd go get the $20,000 Chinese car rather than paying the $30,000 for the equivalent American car. But things don't stop there. If the Chinese car costs 40, the American car company will say, I can raise my price to 35,000, maybe 36,000, maybe 37,000. I'll still be the better deal than the Chinese one, which Americans have to pay 40,000 for. So guess what? The price of electric cars will be higher here in the United States than they are in the rest of the world. But electric cars are not the only electric vehicles, so are trucks. And manufacturers and businesses of all kinds around the world competing with one another have to buy trucks or cars or both of them as inputs into their production process. The United States is going to be losing competition across the board because Americans will have to be paying higher prices for cars and trucks that are electric than their competitors will in the rest of the world. The competitors are gobbling up $20,000 electric vehicles from China, which Americans cannot get because of that tariff. So in fact, we're going to be losing jobs to competitors who don't face it. Next point, and I could go on all night. Next point, by putting a tariff, you're raising the price. We have a name for things when we raise their prices. It's called inflation. And since cars and trucks are a big item in the United States, if either people will buy the Chinese and pay the big tariff, or if they don't, but American producers now protected by the tariff will raise their prices higher than they otherwise could have, we're going to worsen the inflation, which Mr. Biden wants us to celebrate his success in bringing down. And so he carefully doesn't mention that a rising inflation, which what he's done will make worse, has its own effects on what people can afford, therefore how many jobs there'll be to produce, what people won't be able to afford because the price has gone up, and so on. And here's the oldest one, and the one that is most shameful for people like Mr. Biden and my classmate, Janet Yellen, who should have explained this to him, and maybe she did, I'll never know. It's very old. If you're a company that lost a competition, remember, competition has winners and losers. Some companies win. They produce the best quality at the lowest price. Other companies lose. For the last 10 years, American companies have been working, or if not longer, on electric vehicles. The United States government in 2009 gave an enormous loan to Elon Musk to help him develop his Tesla electric vehicles. The United States and the Chinese have competed. One of them won and the other one lost. And there's no way out of that unless you are a liar. So the reason we have this whole problem is that the Chinese produced a better car at a lower price than the Americans. And all the tariff does is protect the loser from the logic of competition, which is If you don't produce a competitively superior product, you go out of business because all the customers go to the better quality, lower price. That's on the 4th of July, we celebrate competition. But here we see all the celebration is mostly BS. And that was always true. Both governments, Chinese and American, subsidize their industry. They do it in lots of different ways, by subsidies, by preferential tax rates, by building a road that's convenient to a factory, by you name it. There's nothing special. The Chinese don't do it more than the Americans. Childish. The only thing that's more childish than that is this genius Madison Avenue ploy of accusing the Chinese, you're going to love this, of having excess capacity. Wow. You mean they have more capacity than they're selling right now? And why might that be? If you produce at a larger capacity, you get what's called economies of scale. It's cheaper per unit. And that's what the Chinese did. Everybody who wins competitions does that. Many American companies do that. But suddenly, because of the media going along with whoever's in power, we have to hear the blathering nonsense of of excess capacity as a critique of the Chinese, which is literally sour grapes because they won and the United States lost. We're not going to let American companies try to catch up. We're not going to let them face the music. We're going to protect them with a tariff that makes all of us face a worse inflation than we might otherwise, have no impact on the jobs of people in fossil fuels, but it will hurt the jobs of people everywhere else who are affected by the failure of Americans to compete with foreigners because they can buy cheap electric vehicles from China and Americans are foreclosed from doing so. This is a lamentable chapter in American history. If this is Bidenomics, it'll go down in history as the colossal farce that it is.
Well, it isn't just a catastrophe. It is a mind, well, I can't use the expression on the American broadcasting system. It is a mind F because, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, for all these years, I've been told that capitalism is great at increasing productivity. And increasing productivity is a great thing. It's what makes us all prosperous. But now we're being, I think this is in effect saying, well, no, some people can have too much productivity. Some people have excess productivity, which leads to excess capacity, and therefore they need to be restrained forcibly if necessary. Am I misinterpreting something?
No, you have to come up with rank garbage because you don't want to face you don't want to face the reality, which is exactly as you put it. There was a race in productivity to produce an electric vehicle. Look, the logic in our society would have been to replace the private automobile that burns gas with a public transportation system because that would be cheaper. That would be even less polluting than electric cars are. That would be the way to go. We didn't do that. That's the fault of capitalism. Next, we had a competition to do the second best, not the best, an electric vehicle. And China and the United States engaged in a competition in which the governments in both countries were deeply involved together with private enterprises. The Chinese won, we lost. This cannot be articulated in the United States. It's like my students who, when I explain to them how the United States lost the war in Vietnam, look at me as if I were making history up. We can't lose. That's not graspable as an idea. And so we can't lose this competition. So what do we hear? They have cheated. Oh, God, really? You're going to try that again? They have excess capacity, or the best one of all. National security requires, oh, how convenient. You've taught every industrial group in this country, the military industrial complex, the medical industry, and now the automobile. Here's what you do. You want to get the government to help you out, come up with some BS about national security, feed it to the politicians. That gives them the cover to give you what you want, the subsidy, the tariff, the tax break, whatever it might be. Or come up, if you can't come up with national security because it's not plausible, then come up with an entirely new nonsense, excess capacity. Any firm that builds more capacity has either two reasons to do it. Either they will go out of business because they're wasting their money, or they've understood economies of scale, and the larger capacity makes them more competitive because they can produce a larger quantity. One or the other is why you have excess capacity and why it has been part of the American competitive capitalist system for hundreds of years. It's just, sorry.
All right. No, listen, Richard Wolff, I grew up inculcated in this ideology, this political and economic ideology that's called capitalism. Maybe you've heard of it.
Yes.
And capitalism tells me that the organization, the party involved, that is able to produce more of something cheaper and better wins, and everybody wins because consumers get to buy this product more cheaply. The person who's done it most efficiently makes the most money. I mean, leaving aside the environmental impact, which is indeed catastrophic, this is basically saying no, military, national security uh, trumps capitalism. But of course, we don't really believe that. So we're not going to say that exactly, because if national security trumped capitalism, then I guess you just nationalize the car companies if it was really critical to national security, draft all the workers. So, but you have to say it somehow. So I'm starting to feel like this is all just gobbledygook that people are saying to justify the most cynical maneuvering on behalf of large, wealthy corporations, and that is carried out by the politicians for whom those corporations are benefactors. Am I being too cynical?
No, and I think I would agree with you. I think the competition between the Chinese and the Americans has been won by the Chinese. By the way, that's happening in many industries and shows no sign of slowing down as we go into the future. It's going to be an embarrassment and a problem for the United States because it keeps denying what's going on and what it means. So it has to come up with other stories to keep the population away from understanding that we are losing the competition with China. But there's the bigger issue, which is we're also losing the competition in terms of the rationality of our society. It's capitalism that says, okay, when you finally have had it with the private automobile that burns gas, all we're interested in is some alternative profit generator. Aha, the electric equivalent of the gas. No, mass transportation would take many fewer resources, would pollute much less, would kill people much less often. The private automobile is a terrible cause of injury and death. So we have an alternative that's better, but capitalism can't even think about it. And that includes China and the United States. Neither of them is making the big transition. The Chinese are further in public transportation than we are, which isn't saying very much given the climate urgency the leaders claim to understand and support. So we're catching this system and you and I are doing it in this conversation, in the explosive problem of its contradictions that are now coming and really smacking us in the face.
So let me give you a few statistics, Richard Wolff,
Good.
from a school of business here in the United States that tracks on an annual basis, obviously not coming from a place of leftism or socialism, it's a business school, tracks the percentage of quote unquote American made motor vehicles that are actually made in the United States of America. 13.5% of some General Motors vehicles are made in the United States, and yet they're not subject to a tariff at all. 18% or less of many Ford vehicles made in the United States. The remainder, 76% or so, there's some lack of clarity here, but some rounding errors or something, but roughly 76% of these Fords made outside the US, roughly 78% of these GM cars, 77%, and so on. We could go down the line, but the point is this: an American made car is not really an American made car. And if you're talking about one worker in five or less, then you could be talking, for example, about giving jobs to people servicing Chinese electric cars. That would cover a lot of them. And if we're talking about a rational system, a system of mass transit, let's say, you could give way more people than work for the auto industry now, it would seem to me, jobs in transportation. And I'll close with an anecdote. I think I've told you before, so I'll make it brief. But and I'm not advocating communism here per se. I'm just saying when I was first in Eastern Europe and Hungary, and it was a communist country, I got on a trolley car, a streetcar, not realizing there was a fare. I guess I thought communism, you don't pay a fare. So I just got on, and an elderly lady, so she would have lived through, at the time, World War II and perhaps the Depression as well, uh, tugged on my sleeve, and said something to me, which my translator translated as comrade. If you don't put in this modest fee, then how can our other comrades who work for the transportation system provide this vital service for us? So here is a woman who probably grew up before motor vehicles were all common in Hungary, understanding the critical role that public transportation played in her economy. And I personally don't believe in mass transit fares, but whether you do or don't, she was saying she felt a sense of purpose, a sense of identification with the mission of mass transit. And it seems to me that when I think about these one out of every five workers or so that works on it, so that is American, that works on American cars, well, I think we could give American workers both jobs and a sense of purpose, and give American customers a sense of purpose by doing things a little bit differently. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, I think let me push you one step further, although this merits its own conversation. Marx's insights include the argument that many of the things that will be part of a socialist or communist future are underway in terms of becoming real already within capitalism. And we shouldn't be surprised at that, because capitalism took over a lot of things that had been developed in feudalism and vice versa all the way back. And here's an example. Once upon a time, it was thought of unthinkable that if you wanted to ride a bicycle, you would have to go buy a bicycle and keep it in your garage or your basement, and then use it as you wished. Nowadays, here in New York City, most of the people here will not buy a bicycle ever. If they want a bicycle, it's on the street. The city maintains bicycle racks on varying streets throughout the city of New York. You want a bicycle, you go out there, you have a little credit card equivalent, and you stick it in the machine, you pull out your bicycle, you use it, and you are paid by the hour. Why is this a good idea? Because most of the time, if you own a bicycle, no one is using it. It is an inefficient arrangement. Okay, so now we are all sharing the bicycles, and therefore many fewer will suffice for our bicycle appetite. Guess what? As the United States capitalism goes down in the face of Chinese and other competitions, we're going to tell our working class, I can see it coming. We can't pay you the way we used to. But don't worry, one of your biggest expenditures will be taken care of, your automobile. Because you know what? Most of the time it sits in your garage or on the street somewhere. It's not used 90% of the time for most of you. And so here's what we're going to do. On the edge of every town and city, there will be a garage or 2 or 10 of them, and they will house cars, just like those racks house bicycles on the street. And when you need a car, you will go using public transportation to that garage and pick one up. It'll be a car that's fully maintained because the garage will have mechanics and people who make sure that all the cars are well taken care of. Everything is, all the insurance, all that'll be taken care of by the service that provides the car. And you won't have to make that absurd expenditure for something you barely use over the slowly Americans will learn they have to live with that because they can't afford a car anyway, and they'll make do with this conveniently located garage that'll let them go and pick whichever car they like, pay a little more for a Cadillac, a little less for a Chevy, etc., etc., etc. It's all coming, and it's been developed by capitalism, which figured out how to have garages at the edge of cities. You know what we call them? Rent-a-car facilities. That's what they already are. So we're half the way there. These things are coming because people have to understand the transition out of capitalism is partly the decline of capitalism that can't do what it used to be able to do. It can't function. And it's going to constrict us and constrain us. And in the process, it will learn how to do things which the next phase of human history will be able to do much more with than was able to be done within the capitalist framework where these ideas were developed. That's how capitalism took over inventions of feudalism, and feudalism took over inventions of slavery, and so on. We're in the middle of this process. And the sad thing is that tariffs of the sort Mr. Biden just threw on China, all they do is mess this process up, slow it down, fill it with friction and tension and the risk of war and fakery, lots of BS to make sure people don't understand that the world has changed, that the American empire is over, and that the ride down is bumpier than the ride up proved to be. And it had its bumps too. That's the really big issue that keeps getting pushed away because we are in that stage of dealing with this that's called denial. And that's not a river in Egypt. That is the crisis that we face, I think, above all of these signs. And we're making terrible, terrible mistakes. Investing these billions, trillions in the electric car, when for much less money we could have gone to really high class public transportation. You know, and if you want to know what I mean by high class, for those of you who've never done it, take a fast train in Europe. You will experience rail travel that you didn't imagine how comfortable, how elegant, how well appointed it all is. We could do that for ourselves. Street railways, regular railways, buses systems that are a pleasure, that go every 5 minutes, that do not require, and it's all cheaper, freeing up millions of people who will not have to make the cars and stand at the gas stations and all the rest of the nonsense that we have. It's inefficient, and capitalism's gross inefficiency is going to be one of the nails in its coffin.
And ironically, I mean, and we haven't even talked about the fact that tariffs are a regressive form of taxation,
That's
especially
right.
on something like this. But it also strikes me that all these things that capitalism is inventing, quote unquote, to force people to ease their let's say, to ease their adaptation into poorer and poorer economic prospects, like what you described about uh, automated rent a cars. We still have already have zip cars and things like that, like the bicycles, like the scooters, all of which I don't know about New York City, but here and elsewhere are privately, corporately owned and maintained. All of these ways of trying to ease the degradation of people's lives so that they don't object too vociferously and make some money in the process. These could all be done by the public for the public, and instead of being harbingers of a grim future, they could be signposts on the way to a better world that's democratically governed. But that's my closing thought. I don't know if you have one of your own.
Yeah, one item that we didn't list, which Americans love to forget. Before you calculate the effect on prices, on jobs of these tariffs, you can't forget, although Mr. Biden clearly tried, that the Chinese are not trees, they're people. They are going to retaliate. They are going to slap tariffs on American goods. And that means American goods can't go into China any more than electric cars can come from China into the United States if you hit them with big tariffs. And that has to be factored in, because if Americans can't sell in China, which is the world's largest and fastest growing market, you are damaging American exports. And that means lots of people are going to get laid off, and they have to be subtracted from the protection you're giving to the people who make fossil fuel cars. When you add it all up, as the recent papers have shown, this is not a program for jobs, even though they claim it. And by exacerbating the tension with China, it's not good for our national security. It is very dangerous for our national security to go down this route.
And I'm going to put a pin in it for our next conversation. For decades, Bill Clinton and George Bush and Hillary Clinton and all the Joe Biden told us that globalization is great. But now
Yeah.
that 1.8 million jobs are gone, now it's bad.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to have to clear that up for me too.
Yeah.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.